it looks as if his friends were ganging up on him. That cannot be a pleasant, experience for Job, because he's not going to feel as if his friends have come to support him. And sometimes, have you ever felt that way with, your friends when you are in a difficult situation and it looks as if nobody is saying something to encourage you? Well, we're going to be looking at that. So you're welcome to Explore the Word podcast, where we do just that. And if you're tuning in for the first time, you're welcome to. The aim of this podcast is to encourage you to develop your relationship with God through the study of His Word. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the chapter 8 of Job, and in previous episode, we looked at chapter 7. And as usual, I'm just going to read and stop when I feel I've got something to talk about. So, verse 1. Then Bildad the Shuhite answered and said, how long would you speak these things, and the words of your mouth be like a strong wind? Now, we have been told here the name of the friend, so certainly it's not the one that was speaking to him before. And again, if we look at the description, Shuhite, I don't know where this place is, but that is a suggestion of where he came from. And as a Sunday school teacher, one of the things that I do tell my children is to let them see that the Bible is true and all the things, the stories we have recorded in them actually happen. So one of the things I would have probably told them at this point is the fact that we're given the name of a person, we're also given where he came from. So if we're really keen on going to check whether that person existed, it may be tedious, but it is not impossible to find if this person actually existed. And in terms of the story, because I know of people that think that the book of Job didn't really happen. So if put together Job and all the places that his friends that was speaking to him before and this friend now, their names were given and the location of where this happened and where they come from, where they came from. So we can use that to trace whether this was really recorded in history. So carrying on, it said, how long would you speak these things, and the words of your mouth be like the strong wind? So maybe he's trying to say that the words he's saying is impactful and is making them feel uncomfortable, because a wind that is strong would destabilize you. That is the only thing I can take away from there. Now, in verse 3, he said, does God subvert judgment, or does the Almighty pervert justice? I was wondering why this particular Bible, my Bible is NKJV, New King James Version. When I looked online on Bible Hub, which is the software I tend to use a lot when I'm studying, I found that every version had it written as, does God pervert judgment, or does the Almighty pervert justice? So I'm wondering why this version chose to use the word subvert. Having said that, the meaning of what he's trying to say is not diminished by that, because essentially what he's trying to say is that God is just. He goes by the due justice or judgment that should be served to somebody. So God would not undermine himself, which is what subvert means, and distortion means, perversion means to distort. So God will not do either of this, which means that this guy believes that what happened to Job is God's judgment on him. So, like I often say, that the words we speak would always give away what is in our mind or what we intend to do, which I can see from what this guy has said. So moving on, in verse 4, he said, if your sons have sinned against him, he has cast them away for their transgression. So really, he meant that God is behind this, that God did this. And there's no other way to describe or explain this other than the fact that that's what it means, because he's categorically saying in verse 4 that the sons deserve what's happened to them. That's God's judgment on them. Now let's go on to verse 5. If you would earnestly seek God and make your supplication to the Almighty, if you were pure and upright, surely now he would awake for you and prosper your rightful dwelling place. I'm going to stop there for a number of reasons. The first is that I think he's right in saying that if Job would earnestly seek God, because if we earnestly seek God in any situation, that is what would make us to get a response to what we're asking the Lord. So that principle is right. It doesn't mean that Job was not. Job, we can see him is struggling and talking to God. Sometimes he's being, very confrontational with God. At other times, he's reference. But the principle of what this guy is saying is that we know that if you ask and seek God earnestly, he would answer you. So I'm agreeing with him there with that principle, not necessarily with what he's using it to back his argument. And he says, and make supplication to the Almighty. So that's still part of seeking God. Now, it now said, if you were pure and upright, surely now he would awake for you. In other words, what is stopping God from answering Job? This is what he's saying. What is stopping God from answering Job is because of Job's sin. And so he's suggesting to Job to repent, just like the other friend that spoke earlier, suggested the same. But this guy is coming out point blank to say, because that other one did not point blank say this, but this one is saying exactly the fact that Job sinned and his sons and his children also did something. Now, he carried on then to say, surely now he would awake. So the other thing I want to talk about is that word awake. I've just written in my Bible here the word remember. Sometimes you see some words being used in scriptures that may suggest, okay, for instance, if you say God would awake, does it mean that God was sleeping before? We know that God does not sleep. It's the same way that the psalmist, you see a lot of times in the Psalms that the psalmist will say, oh, remember me, O Lord. Or the case of Hannah, God said, it's written in the scriptures that, and the Lord remembered Hannah. It didn't mean that God forgot before. What it just implies is that it's time to forget, that it was God's time, and then it decided to act at that point. That was the right time to act. So, I think it's we can look at the word awake here in that kind of light, that it does not mean that God was asleep or is sleeping, and when it's time for him to walk, he would then wake up and do and walk. So carrying on in verse 7, this guy said, though your beginning was small, he was speaking to Job, yet your latter end would increase abundantly. So remember, he's still carrying on to saying that if Job had repented, so to say, if he had sought God, if he had approached God, then God would have, done something. And what God would have done is that he would, restore. That's what he's trying to say. He would restore, he would hear him and prosper him, he said in the earlier verse. And he now said, though your beginning was small, yet your later end would increase abundantly. This is one of the things that struck me here, that this man, I think God was actually speaking through him, because this sounds prophetic to me, because we know now, because we have the whole picture, that indeed the end of Job was much greater than his beginning, and that everything he lost was restored to him, and he ended up again with 10 children, well, not double children, but every other thing that is recorded later was doubled. And so his end is actually became greater than his beginning. So sometimes I feel that as children of God, we should be mindful, of what we say, of the way we are, what we allow to come out of our mouths, and just reserve our mouth for the Lord to use, because we don't know when things, the Lord would want to use our mouths or our utterances. And if we don't keep ourselves separate, dedicated unto God, then I think we may not necessarily be ready instruments for Him to use when He needs to he needs somebody to use to speak a word. Because I have seen some verses or things, that you see in the book of Psalms, and you say that whoever said this, God just took control of their mouth and said that. They didn't. I don't think they would have thought about it before saying it, and yet there are words that were said and they actually came to pass as precisely as the utterances. So I think this is one of it, and let me know your thoughts about this. So in verse 8, this man said, "For inquire please of the former age, and consider things discovered by our fathers. For we were born yesterday, and know nothing, because our days on earth are a shadow. Will they not teach you and tell you and utter words from their heart?" So what is advising Job again to do, aside of seeking God, is probably, thinking that there will be older people around, some people that know God, and they're wise people because they're older than us. They have seen the way things happen. They know about life. If Job goes to speak to them, they're likely going to counsel him and let him know or see that he had sinned, or that his children sinned. Because why else would he be encouraging Job to go and seek those people? Is for clarity, or maybe wisdom, understanding of what is the situation is. And I'm thinking mostly so that he's thinking that the elders around there would also feel the same. Having said that, the scripture did not record any other person other than these three people to have come to see Job. And I wonder why. Because we know that Job, not only was the Lord, did the Lord declare that he was righteous and walking and being pleasant to people around him. His friends also testified to his, the attitude he had to people around him, the way he supported people. I think that was in chapter 4. But why is it that it's only these three people? Where are the other people that could have come to console him? I wonder why that is the case with Job. So I don't know. What do you think? Another thing I thought about is the fact that it looks as if his friends were ganging up on him. That cannot be a pleasant, experience for Job, because he's not going to feel as if his friends have come to support him. And sometimes, have you ever felt that way with, your friends when you are in a difficult situation and it looks as if nobody is saying something to encourage you? So in verse 11 it said, "Can the papyrus grow up without a mash? Can the reed flourish without water? While it is yet green and not cut down, it withers before any other plant. So the path of all who forget God and the hope of the hypocrite shall perish." Right. So here I think is talking about, using those plants. They are real plants. I think they're water plants. And he's trying to see, the principle of how nature operates. The nature of this plant is that they need to be in water constantly. So we have some, like maybe pondweed, something like that. And if they're taken out of water, well, a lot of plants don't live in water, and if they can survive without, so to say, physical water that you will see. whereas those water plants cannot. So this is what he's saying there. That while they're yet green and not cut down, it withers before any other plant. So in other words, if they're taken away from the source. So he's now saying that that will be the case with that must be the case for Job, because Job is a hypocrite. Now I like the way in scriptures, particularly a lot of these things I have seen when people are talking, same in the book of Psalms, they use a lot of principles of how things happen in nature to explain things, and that is understandable, because I also believe that God, the creator of nature, puts those things in around us so that we can understand some of these principles, and we know that life is governed by principles, and with those understanding and knowledge we can use them to guide our life. So they are right in using those principles to buttress their point, even though we know there is a fundamental error of judgment for them, because they are both claiming, now this second guy is claiming that Job sinned, and that what has happened to him is a consequence of his sins, which we know that is not the case. So that principle is flawed because their understanding is limited, and they're forging ahead to buttress their point, even though we know that their understanding is limited and flawed. So carrying on in verse 14, he said, "Whose confidence shall be cut off, and whose trust is a spider's web?" Well, to this spider, relatively, the web is strong, and it is strong. But we know that when you are not a spider, to a human being or to even other bigger animals, the web is not strong. So it's something that you cannot trust, relatively. And whose trust is a spider's web? In other words, very fickle and unreliable. He's still talking about hypocrites. Now in verse 15 it said, "He leans in his house, but does not stand. He holds it fast, but it does not endure. Now he grows green in the sun, and his branches spread out in his garden. His roots wrap round the rock heap and look for a place in the stone. If he is destroyed from this place, then it will deny him, saying, I have not seen you." I'm not sure I fully understand what he's saying here, but what I think essentially that he's saying is the fact that in the case of the root, I sometimes go in the woods and you see sometimes when, particularly the pine trees, I'm usually quite, surprised that when you see them fall, which I see a lot of them in the woods nearby to me, you see that their roots are not very deep actually. That's probably why they fall, because when you look at their height, they are usually quite tall. And I would not have expected trees like that, something that's that tall, to have such spread out roots, rather shallow but not deep. That is why, in many cases, when you have pine trees next to the road, because of the way their root system is, that is not really deep and spreads out, they tend to destroy roads and make the place bumpy. So going back to what this guy is saying, I think it's what should I say, is comparing the hypocrites with somebody with that kind of tree, that instead of the root system to go right down into the soil, it's wrapped around the rock, and if something happens, it can easily fall over. That's my thoughts. I don't have full understanding of this. So in verse 19, he carried on saying, "Behold, this is the joy of his way, and out of the earth others will grow." Now, I marked this word, his way, in my Bible, because I just remembered that The followers of Jesus Christ, the early Christians were called the followers of the way. So we see it again here, the joy of his way. In other words, the way of the Lord. And out of the earth others will grow. Behold, God will not cast away the blameless, nor will he uphold the evildoer. He's absolutely right by that statement because God is just. It's just that it's not applicable to Job. 21 it says, he will yet fill your mouth with laughter and your lips with rejoicing. Is that not prophetic again? Because that is what happened to Job eventually. And the other thing that occurred to me when I read this place first is that this is a proclamation that we can make with to one another. I think I've already used this verse to speak to a friend to say that he will fill your mouth with laughter and your lips with rejoicing. That is a proclamation I'd like us to make use from time to time. Speak life, speak goodness into people, into the lives of people around us. These are gems that we get from the scriptures. And one of the things that really impresses me about this book is how much of this I've been coming across, just like when you read the book of Psalms. Now, lastly, he now said, those who hate you will be clothed with shame, and the dwelling place of the wicked will come to nothing. So again, I'm not sure why he's saying this, but actually, I think I do know why he's saying this. It's referring to God, that those who hate God will be clothed with shame, and the dwelling place of the wicked will come to nothing, which is going to be the ultimate end of people that do not know God. I hope you have gotten value from this episode today, and thank you for spending your time with me today. And if you have got some value, I would encourage you to like and share with your friends and family, and also to look out for the next episode, which will be on chapter 9, and we would be looking at that next week. So hope to see you next time. Bye.